Okay, now if I just adjust the lighting here, is it going to cause problems with people falling asleep? No, that's a bit better. I prefer to get the ones at the front. Is that all right? Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I'm here in the US for 6 months and enjoying my time at ASU. And so really my talk today is all about lying and deception. And I would like to thank, first of all, the American people for providing a very, very interesting reality TV show for me over the last few months. I've actually been following this very closely, and there's some fantastic examples of lying and deception that seems to have no cost at all associated with it. But the research that I'm usually associated with is work on animal performance. Most of my work is on non-human animals. And what I'm really interested in is what underlies success for an individual organism. Now, success can be thought of in terms of fighting, in terms of escaping a predator or capturing prey, in mating situations, or just moving around doing stuff. And I apply these sorts of methodologies, this evolutionary framework, to sports players as well. And I've just got back from a trip to Spain where I've been working with soccer players and applying the methods that we do there. And that's a personal passion and a hobby of mine. But anyway, that's my general area of research. If you've got any questions about that broader scope, then I'll be happy to talk with you about that this afternoon. But what I'm really going to be focusing on today is signals. Signals associated between individuals of the same species. Okay, there are two forms. And now I know a lot of you have got a background in signalling theory, but I'm going to go through it quite briefly. So if I bore the hell out of you, stay with me, okay? So the signalling is really two different forms. One is in terms of signalling your intention of aggressiveness, okay? Other is signals of sexiness, okay? Now, these two signals I study in terms of, what creates success. But what I'm focusing on today, especially with the first half of my talk, is signals of aggressiveness, okay? Now, most of us will be familiar with this in human culture, okay? Especially on the sporting field. They're actually quite ritualistic in nature, is a lot of signalling theory, and I want you to remember this picture because it's very similar to what my organisms do. But what happens when individuals are displaying aggression, sometimes it breaks down and it turns into physical combat. Okay? What I'm interested in is both forms here, the signalling of strength and the breakdown into physical combat. And being the maybe slightly inappropriate, sadistic animal behavioural ecologist that I am, I really love watching animals fight. Okay? It's really cool. Okay, we can't do this in human culture now, mostly, in terms of gladiatorial bouts, but fighting occurs across so many different species. And what animals are doing is they're fighting over resources, mates, territories, food. Okay, but there are huge costs associated with going into battle and fighting. And obviously the huge cost is death to one of the opponents. So it makes sense in these sorts of situations when individuals are fighting over a resource that they try and work out their differences before it escalates into really costly situations, injuries or possibly death. And this is where signalling comes into it. Signaling your intention or signalling your potential strength so that others can judge that and judge their relative strength and then back down accordingly or escalate accordingly. And not surprisingly, because of the importance of resources for individual fitness, across all groups of organisms, you've got this overt evolution of weaponry. And these weapons are there are designed to be able to communicate to individuals of your species your potential to do harm to those individuals. So whether it's, showing teeth or horns, They're very common across the animal world, and they allow organisms to de-escalate combat accordingly when it's obviously favourable to do so. So what we're really thinking about here in terms of signalling for fighting is there's a signal of strength. In this case, we've got an individual, Muhammad Ali, who can be signalling his strength by showing his muscles. Okay? And we would expect the display of these strengths to be associated with their strength. And that strength should be associated with their ability to inflict costs on their opponent. So there's a connection between the signal of strength and actual strength and what they can do in a fight. Okay? Now there's been some great research by a whole heap of groups about these signals of strength and whether they are honest indicators of an individual's quality or ability to inflict costs on an opponent. Here's one. This is an eastern collared lizard, okay, found in the US. And what these individuals do is that males often sit on the top of rocks. They display to opponents, and they will display their head and do this gaping response. And what they're essentially doing here is showing to an opponent the size of their head and also the width of their muscle. They can actually show their muscle to an opponent and say, don't mess with me because this is the potential cost I could put onto you. Okay? And then you can test the relationship between size of the head and strength of the jaw, and the size of the muscle, by measuring biting strength. Lizards are very aggressive. You give them something to bite down on, they'll bite down. And you find that this is a really close relationship between strength of the animal and the signal they are displaying. So what we find is that most of these signals across the animal world are honest signals of strength. Okay? What I'm interested in are those signals that deviate from these honest signals. I'm really interested in questions about how frequent is cheating in nature, what are the incentives and costs for cheating, and what environmental factors can vary the frequency of cheating. Now the difficulty with studying cheating in non-human animals is it's bloody difficult to detect. You can't go up to the animal and ask them, and it's often extremely difficult to detect something, a signal, and its quality when the whole point of the signal is to go undetected. So this is quite difficult to study. Okay? So usually in the past, the way researchers have studied it is looked at things like, here's a signal of quality in a house sparrow. So in a house sparrow, this is called a badge of status. This is a male, this is a female, this is a male, this is a female. And what this badge of status is showing is it's a large patch of black on the chest, and it's just saying, you know, I'm crap hot, okay, leave me alone, I am high status. This individual is obviously not signalling that. But what researchers could do is, what if we take this individual and we paint it all black? Okay? What happens when there are cheaters in the population? What controls the frequency of this cheating? And what we find is if we take this poor individual here, paint its chest black, all the other individuals around it recognise it as a strong individual, and the other strong individuals challenge it to fights. And it gets the hell beaten out of it. Okay? And that is the cost associated with being a cheater in a population. What maintains low levels of cheating? The same goes for female paper wasps, with some beautiful work over the last 10 years being done by Elizabeth Tibbets. And what she's done is looked at a similar badge of status but in female paper wasps, and this is the head, the face of paper wasps, and these little black lines here, arbitrary little black lines, okay, indicate the strength of these individuals. Okay, the more broken the signal, okay, this is less, broken, more broken, the higher the quality of the individual. Again, researchers can come along and manipulate this, paint it all black or make it more broken, and see what the consequences of artificially creating a dishonest individual. And the cool thing about Elizabeth's work here is that if you take a really poor quality individual and you create a high quality individual or signals of high quality, then they get attracted by the high quality individuals, they beat it up, and the beating they get is proportional to how much higher they are displaying their status. So if it's a really low quality individual displaying really high status, they will get punished to a larger extent than an individual which is medium status, which is displaying high. So there are significant costs here associated with being dishonest individuals. I'm not interested in studying those sorts of systems. What I was really interested in studying is natural forms of dishonesty. Can we actually go out there and study natural forms without actually having to do these manipulations and see what the advantages are for higher amounts of dishonesty and what the incentives are for pushing it down? So what are the cost benefits for natural forms of dishonesty? Okay, so this is a picture of me from a few years ago, okay? And this, obviously, if I walked into a bar like this and behaved in a really aggressive way, okay, people are going to react as if, whoa, very strong, I'm not going to mess with this person. Obvious, clear case of being able to display my strength, okay? The muscles here will show that I'm strong, okay? But what if I was sitting in a bar nowadays, the individual that I've turned into, and this individual came up and started being aggressive to me? What would I do under these circumstances? Okay, this might seem like a nebulous example, but work with me here. Okay, so if Batman sits down beside me, starts getting in my face, what should I do? The problem is that Batman could actually be the real Batman, Christian Bale, underneath, and then if I escalated the fight, I'd be in trouble. There's a lot of muscles under there, okay? Now what if there's an alternative Batman who's in my face, okay? Underneath that is not such an intimidating character, and I probably could have done very well in that combat if I'd escalated, despite the fact of the strength he was displaying. As I said, it might sound like a silly example, but this is exactly what crayfish, crustaceans, have to deal with all the time. They are displaying their strength to their opponents by displaying their weaponry, their claws. But they're essentially wearing a Batman suit. Their ability to inflict costs on their opponent, what determines the costs on their opponent, is underneath their exoskeleton. It's the muscle inside their shell. And so what I have been working on for the last 5-10 years has really been looking at the signals of strength used by these crustaceans and how they relate to fighting success and how they relate to the strength of the individual. This is a form of dishonesty. And I'll work through this and show you how it is. Okay, this is a species of crustacean that I've done most of my work on. It's called the slender crayfish. It's found on the sand islands throughout southeast Queensland, where I usually work in Brisbane, subtropical area of Australia. Beautiful sand islands, there's freshwater creeks on there, and they're found in high number in this environment. Okay, these are two. Okay, before I go into that, what I want to do is I want to explain to you the sorts of displays that go on. Now, I remember showing you before the two soccer players pushing up against each other. Well, when crustaceans come up against an opponent, it's a highly ritualistic combat. So they first come up, they've got their long antenna, and they extend their long antenna to the opponent, and it's more like touching the long antenna. Okay, and the way I interpret that okay, is they're just talking to each other over a fence, long way over a fence, going, get away from me, I hate you. The other one's going, piss off, I hate you too. And then if they don't sort out their differences at that stage, then they go up close. So they might go right next to across the fence, okay? And then they've got their four short antennae, and you'll see this in the video. And then they start to bicker. You can see it, they're whipping each other with the four antennae. If they don't sort out their differences there, then the next ritualistic stage, which is quite curious, is that one of them will lay down its claws and the other one will lift it up and tap and rub, and then put down its claws, and the other one will tap and rub. And if they don't sort out their differences there, it escalates to a proper fight. Okay? So let's see some of these examples. This is like some little bickering going on here with a short antenna. We've gone into a little bit of claw tapping going on. Now remember, an individual can run away at any stage here. This is in the bickering stage as well. It's starting to escalate somewhat here. I won't deny, this is great research to do and fun to watch. Some of these fights I've seen go on for more than 90 minutes. So some of the fights resemble something like you see in the scenes in The Matrix. It's really cool to watch. Okay, so here we've got slender crayfish. What we're really interested in doing, again, is looking at the size of the signal, which is these claws, these chela, if you like, and we can measure their strength. Now, these individuals are highly aggressive. You pick them up, they are just trying to get you at all times. All you have to do is point their claws towards a force transducer, put it in between the claw, and then they'll squeeze down and they'll indicate exactly how strong they are. And then you can put them in a tank and battle. Cool thing about crayfish is you put them in a tank, they orient themselves, and then they turn around and they look for some other crayfish, and they see another crayfish, and then they head towards it. Okay? Very, very nice group to study in terms of aggressive communication. Okay, so if we look here at the relationship between the claw size and the claw strength, what we find is enormous variability in the quality of the signal. So you can get individuals that are showing and displaying very large claws to their opponents. They're trying to intimidate the opponents with their large claws, but they can be extremely weak. So there seems to be a top end of how strong these individuals can be. You can only fit so much muscle into a claw. But below that top end is a huge amount of variance. Okay? This is really the bare bones of dishonest communication here. Not only that, is that some individuals will have highly asymmetrical claws. Okay? But the smaller claw is not necessarily the weaker claw. So what we've found here, we've got force of the weaker claw, force of the stronger claw, and there's huge variance here on that. Okay? But these claws here are not always the larger of the claw. Here we've got difference in claw size, and here's difference in force. So we would expect a perfect relationship here, but there is a lot of variance going on. Is that there can be a huge difference in claw size, but no difference here. Okay, no difference or a huge difference in strength. Okay, so what that means is an individual coming up against another one doesn't know how strong they are based on their claws alone, doesn't know how strong the claws are relative to each other based on the relative differences in claw size. Okay, they're masters of deception in this case. If we look at differences between males and females here, okay, there's huge differences in males and females. It looks like there is no relationship here, but if you focus down on here in this section here, it's very similar in shape to the males. It's just that the females have smaller claws than the males, but there's an equal amount of variance. So firstly, what we wanted to look at is how does the size of a claw relate to the strength and relate to whether they win fights or not. Okay, so we can look at the size of the weapon, the strength of the weapon, and who's successful in that. Okay. Now this is the winning predictive model from all of our data. The most important thing I want to show you from this is the females. Okay, and what we find is there is a significant relationship between claw size, the weapon, and claw strength. And claw strength is an important determinant of who wins the fights. Okay? Claw size is not a direct determinant of dominance in females. Now, if we look at the males, this situation is totally different. What we find is the relationship between claw strength and dominance is almost non-existent. Claw size is essentially the only determinant of dominance here. Okay? It's claw size, not strength. Now, why is this the case? Okay? This is proportion of fights or encounters that are decided from fights or displays. And this is females and males. What we find is that most of the encounters that occur between two females, are decided by physical confrontations. They escalate quickly, they decide it based on who wins the actual grappling and fighting. Most of the encounters, or at least 50% of the encounters, okay, for males, are decided by just signalling alone, which means they're making mistakes. An individual will often back down against another individual even though they're stronger. So here is a case of dishonesty, of having a poor quality signal, being weaker for your claw size, where it's paying. Individuals are not testing them. Females, they're being tested, and it's less likely as a signal to work. Okay? So this was in the slender crayfish here. What about another species of crustacean? Okay? Here's an even more curious example of dishonesty. This is the two-tone fiddler crab. Okay, again found in southeast Queensland. Same sort of pattern that you would see in the slender crayfish. When you look at the size of the claw and the strength, there's huge variance here. But a really cool thing about this species is that when the males lose their claw, so from predation events, where they've managed to escape, if they lose their big claw here that's used to intimidate rivals, they grow a new claw, and the new claw is very different. This is an original claw, this is a new claw. The original claw has got these tubercles in here, like that, a really broad area of the claw. This is a narrower part of the claw, and this top section is much longer, and there's virtually no tubercles on it. And because of mechanical advantage, the longer fingers here, they can't squeeze as much. That's much more reduced in terms of a weapon. If you look at the strength for regenerated versus original claws and the force, you can see that the regenerated hardly produce any force at all for their actual length. But it's still being used as a signal to intimidate rivals. This is another form of deception here. Yeah?
I'm not sure if I'm missing this or what,
yeah.
But what's the evidence that they're actually using the claw in their judgments in the contest?
So,
you're showing that there's the production, the signal's there, but it's not clear that they could be not using some other piece of information in making their determinant.
Right, yeah, okay. We've got some experiments. I'll walk through some additional experiments, and if it's still not clear from that, we'll get back to that. Okay, So what we know at this stage, okay, is the way it operates is how do individuals go about determining how strong my opponent is and whether to escalate or not. What do we see here? So what we've done is we've put them against a whole range of different individuals of varying sized claws. So we think about this as, well, think about this. I've got a picture of me in here. Think about this from my perspective, okay? What should I do in terms of escalating a contest, okay? When should I fight? So again, we've got Batman here who is who has got various different sizes of claws. I don't know how strong he is. And what we're finding so far is that these individuals will be prepared to escalate. And these, in my case, I would be prepared to escalate against all of these individuals. Okay? But in reality, the only time it gets escalated, a fight, is under these circumstances. Fighting takes place and the stronger crayfish wins. So if we go back to the slender crayfish example, where claw strength is not a good predictor of who wins the fight, it's a very good predictor, but only under these circumstances. The problem is that a lot of individuals are making mistakes here. So this individual, I may decide to back down when I might be a lot stronger than this individual, okay? This individual might back down against me, okay, but maybe a lot stronger. It's all being determined on relative claw size alone, whether they escalate or not. Okay, so what I wanted to do here is use that as a background to understand what are the incentives for deception or dishonest signalling, and what are the costs imposed on that. When would we expect more levels of deception? When will we expect less levels, fewer levels of deception? Okay, so what are the possible benefits of deception here? Okay, if this individual, okay, beats these individuals purely on signalling, they're not willing to escalate, okay, because they've got much smaller claws, and I win without combat, then there's the energy saved from not fighting, plus there may be metabolic savings associated with not filling my muscle, my claws, with expensive muscle that I have to look after all the time. Okay? In terms of these sorts of combats, well, I'm going to lose if I'm weaker, win if I'm stronger, but in either case, if I don't have much muscle in there, again, they could have metabolic savings associated with not putting much muscle in my claw. Okay, so that's what I wanted to do, is look at the possible metabolic costs of ramming muscle into the claw, and thus the incentive for not putting muscle in there. Okay, first let's have a look at the slender crayfish. Now we've got males, okay, who are deciding most of their fights on signalling alone, not fighting. Females that are deciding most of their fights on their disputes on fighting. Okay, if we look at the oxygen consumption, so we can take these claws, dissect out the muscle, and then test out how expensive that muscle is to keep operating. We can do that in a metabolic chamber. We can measure the tissue oxygen consumption per gram. What we find is that the females are investing a hell of a lot more in expensive muscle. The males, the muscle they have in their claws is quite inexpensive. Okay? But on a per gram basis, because males have got a hell of a lot larger claws, okay, there is no difference between the males and females in total claw costs, in terms of the metabolic costs of the entire claw. Okay? Now, this is total claw. If we look on what this muscle in the claw is capable of producing in terms of force, we find that the male muscle per square metre of muscle, okay, is only producing half the amount of force than the females. So the males are packing in lower quality muscle that's cheaper, that can't produce as much force into their claws. Okay. What about the original versus regenerated for the fiddler crab? Here, we looked at some of the biochemistry of the muscle taken from original claws and regenerated claws, and we looked at the enzyme activity of those. This is really what underlies the metabolic power of the muscle itself. What we find is there's no differences at all between these different types of enzymes. Biochemically, there is no difference between the muscle taken from regenerated claws or from original claws. If we look at the muscle oxygen consumption, okay, no differences as well on a per gram basis, but because the regenerated ones are packing in a lot less muscle, they're saving a lot more energy in terms of the metabolic expense. Now, taking all this information together, what does it mean in terms of savings? Well, for an individual that packs in 50% less claw muscle, it saves 50% in terms of its metabolic rate. This is an enormous incentive for putting in less muscle into the claw. A 15% lower total metabolic rate, which means this sort of energy can be diverted to things like growth or reproduction. Okay, so the incentives here are quite high. What about the costs of unreliable signalling? Okay, what's pushing against being weaker all the time? Why doesn't everyone cheat in these circumstances? Now, using previous studies that have manipulated the size of the badges of status here, what we would expect is individuals that have large claws, that have not got a lot of muscle in those, so they're essentially displaying low quality signals. If they get caught and found out, you would expect those individuals to get beaten up. There should be receiver-dependent costs associated with these. And so that's what we wanted to pursue and investigate. We wanted to look at individuals across various populations, okay, throughout southeast Queensland in terms of the two-tone fiddler crabs, and look at the relationship between claw size and claw strength. And what we would expect is in populations where the purported costs for getting caught are higher, the costs of getting caught cheating are higher, we would expect them to be stronger for their size. But if you're in a population that is less likely to get caught cheating, then you would expect them to be weaker for their size. Okay? So what does this mean? Okay, so we went to 10 populations throughout southeast Queensland, okay, and we wanted to compare that would potentially vary in the receiver-dependent costs. What do I mean by that? This is a typical habitat here for a two-tone fiddler crab, which is the edge of a mud flat. And what we would expect is we might see that the extent of dishonest signalling will vary according to the frequency of punishment. So for example, if you're from a low population density, the chances that this individual is going to get tested and caught cheating may be lower than an individual that's from this population that is interacting with way more individuals at a time. Furthermore, we would expect the magnitude of punishment to affect whether they were going to have dishonest signalling or not. So if you're from a population with smaller individuals and you get caught cheating, the cost of being punished is probably a lot lower than the cost in this population where you've got larger individuals with larger potential weapons. So what we expect is both the average size of a population and the density will affect the amount of dishonest signalling in a population. Okay? So what we found was both of these factors affected the relative strength of the claw, the amount of dishonest signalling. Together, we have we found it independently, both density and the average size, and together, population biomass here, which is versus the relative claw strength, and we found this is a strong positive relationship. So what this means is for individuals from populations that are large in size and high density are more likely to have weaponry that are much stronger for their claw size. Okay. Those individuals from low density populations and populations with smaller individuals are going to be much weaker claws for their size. Okay? So in other words, these individuals up here are going to be from populations that are high density, large individuals on average. These individuals, low density, small individuals. Okay? So what we see here in terms of unreliable signals in crustaceans is that it's common, but it's still being used. Okay? There's substantial energetic benefits. We can see from the metabolic costs that they can save. And there is obviously environmental factors that are going to affect the frequency of that. If you can get away with it, why not save on the costs of packing muscle into your claw? So one question that I often get asked is, are individuals aware of their own strength? Do they display behaviours that seem to indicate that they know how strong they are? Okay? So this is related in a way to some of Bob Triver's work on self-deception. And the idea here is that an animal is better placed to fool competitors when it is unaware of its own deception, or animals are better liars when they believe their own lies. Can we see something like this in such a simple animal like a crayfish? So maybe this question about whether they are aware of their own strength could provide evidence for an early evolution of self-deception. So the way I looked at this, the way we looked at it is we looked at a hell of a lot of different individuals, okay, about 40 individuals that varied in the amount of muscle in their claws. So individuals with varying strength. Okay? And we put these individuals against 7, there's only 6 here, but there was 7 different groups of size. Okay? And what we wanted to know was, did the individuals with differing amounts of muscle react differently or were different in the way they would escalate towards opponent based on the amount of muscle? So the weaker individuals, were they only prepared to escalate against the smaller individuals, while the stronger individuals are actually more likely to escalate against individuals that are in fact larger than them? So is there a degree of self-awareness? Now this is a complex graph that is difficult to interpret and see based on a model that takes into consideration an individual's claw size relative to an opponent, individual's claw strength relative to an opponent, but also whether it was prepared to escalate a fight. Which individuals was it prepared to escalate a fight in terms of those? Okay, this is differences in claw size, this is residual force, and this is the probability of escalating a fight. So think about it just from this perspective for a moment, okay? If an individual, okay, is here, this is when it's coming against an opponent that is exactly equal in size to itself, okay? So what you would expect is it's not escalating, it's not prepared to, sorry, it is probability of fighting, okay. it's not prepared to escalate because the individual that it's up against is larger, and then when it's larger, it's prepared to escalate. Okay? Now this, along this axis, is the effect of force, how strong that individual is. And what you see is there may be a slight change here in the relationship. Okay? These ends differ. Okay? But there's not a huge effect. I'm going to try and visualise it in a different way. Okay? It's not much better in terms of visualisation, but let me try. Okay? This is residual force, how strong the crayfish is. This is the differences in claw size between the individuals. Now, if an individual was fully aware of its strength, okay, we would expect it to fight in this space here. In this space here, it's strong, okay, for most of the time, and when it's not, they should only fight under these circumstances, okay? We would expect the individuals to flee under these circumstances here and fight under here. This is where our predictive relationship is. This is what the data tell us. And so, what we expect is that individuals in this entire space here should be fighting. Individuals in this entire space here should be running away. Only the relationship here is only predictive of this amount. Okay? If we would expect the animals to be fully aware of their own strength, this is where they should be fighting. Only the animals in this space are, and there are only animals in here. Well, in terms of the model, there's actually no individuals in there, but should be getting it right. So what we find is they are aware of their strength, significantly aware of their strength, but it is only affecting their behaviour to a tiny extent. Nowhere near what we would expect in terms of what we should see them to do based on their strength alone. So really, do we see an example of crustaceans displaying a precursor of deception? We know from the work we did on two-tone fiddler crabs is that the animals that are grown up in low density and low size populations are having much weaker claws for their size. So their bodies are detecting these signals and they're responding accordingly. They can detect their environment around them. Okay? Not only that, they are behaving as if they've got awareness of their own deception, but they're only changing their behaviour in a way that's only a small portion of that. Okay? I showed this work to Bob Trivers. He's convinced it's a precursor to self-deception. I'm not necessarily convinced yet. I would like to do some more manipulative experiments to do so. But it's an interesting aspect to pursue some of this work. So before I start talking about some of the human work that I did, some notes of interest that I'm interested in some of your thoughts here. I mean, most of you work on humans rather than non-human animals, okay? And what I know from the work that I've done on contest behaviour is that when two individuals of the same species come up against each other, they show their maximum resource holding potential. They display it. Okay? There's no chance of ambiguity about underrepresenting themselves. But humans are an example where this doesn't necessarily happen. And it's a curious example, and how that feeds into signalling behaviour in humans in terms of aggressive communication is quite interesting to me. Animal will not try and diminish its status. But here you can take Ralph Macchio, or whatever his name was, I can't remember what his name, okay, and you'd think that this individual would be, the lowest quality, not going to harm you at all, he's not displaying high strength. But you don't necessarily know that he is the Karate Kid who can kick your ass, okay? Humans don't necessarily display their maximum resource holding potential. There is such ambiguity there that it should affect the way that we interpret signalling and escalation in a different way to most other animals. And obviously, a more modern example of this is the fact that you can get yoga pants where you can conceal a weapon. So humans carrying weapons around, again, you've got an escalation between individuals. You don't know whether someone is packing some sort of weapon that could change the contest in its entirety. And you don't get those examples in non-human animals. So the way I'm starting to think about this system and the way of thinking about contest behaviour in non-human animals is really, I've started working with mathematicians to try and make sense of why crayfish still engage in this fighting, why they still pay attention to the signal of the size of the claw when there's such variability in reliability. And so we're trying to model this. And really the factors of interest here, if you think about weapon size and strength, is the variance here. There's always going to be variance, okay? But the size of this variance should affect how an individual interprets another signal. Not only that, you would get the maximum strength should also affect the contest behaviour of an opponent. So if you look at claw size here and claw strength, the way you would really try to model this is thinking about what are the size differences here between, if this is one opponent and another opponent, okay, what are the size differences here, okay, and how does that relate to the variance that occurs in this signal? And how does this relate to the possible maximal force that could be, the maximum quality of that signal as well? And I think bringing these factors in together and modelling these will provide a much better predictive value for understanding this behaviour in organisms. So, okay, now I've been speaking about structural forms of dishonesty and natural forms of dishonesty. And one day I had a grad student of mine, okay, Gwendolyn David, come into our office, and she was aware of a lot of the crayfish work that we were doing. And she said, Robbie, I'm really curious about, she's totally obsessed with soccer. Okay, she had trials at Liverpool when she was younger. Probably Liverpool was not good at that stage when she was trying, you know. But she, very, very good football player. Okay, and she knows I'm obsessed with football as well, and she said, Robbie, I think we can use this cost-benefit framework to understand signalling in soccer players as well. And I said, look, you had me at soccer players, speak on, I love it. And she said, what about the behaviour of diving? And I said, look, I've done it many times during a game, I'm still listening, speak on. And she said, well, what affects the frequency of diving in football? I said, bloody hell, you're right. Benefit cost analysis, we can look at that. So the idea is to look at diving in soccer players. Now this is like a behaviour that I presume most of you are aware of. I couldn't embed my video in my talk this morning, so I'm going to switch over to a video of this here. But this will give you an indication of what diving really is all about and how it's a deceptive behaviour, and there's some great examples here. He could have been shot. This is my favourite. Yes. Oh dear. Okay, so what diving is all about here is really, it's a signal by an individual to the referee in the game. So there is the signaller, the person with the ball, the receiver is the referee. Now remember, there's enormous money in soccer. Okay, this is a signal that can make a crap load of money and a huge advantage for a team. It's a form of lying that actually counts. Okay, they care about getting this right. So here we can have a legitimate foul. Okay, this is from the 2010 World Cup final where a Dutch player kicks the Spanish player in the chest. Okay, this poor fella goes down and doesn't get a free kick at all. And he doesn't get sent off. Does he? No, he doesn't get sent off at all. It's hilarious. So obviously this guy falling down after getting kicked in the chest, a legitimate reason to fall on the ground and to be hurt. Now this is Didier Drogba, and he's infamous. He's like a man mountain, but seems to be able to throw himself on the ground at the same time. Okay, and here he's famous for throwing himself on the ground when not being touched. Okay, so there's two forms of people falling over. They can be real, they can be not so real. Okay, the referee decides, is the receiver here, what the appropriate action should be. Okay, he can decide that it's a penalty on the signaller, okay, or can decide that the signaller has been faking it and punish the faker. Okay, so here we've got the receiver making a decision about what's appropriate. So the data collection that we did here is we looked at 6 professional leagues. Okay, the German league, we've got the Australian league, hardly a professional league, it's the Australian league, the Spanish league, the French, the Dutch and the Italian league. We've got 10 games in each league, we've got 60 games and a total of 2,800 falls. So that's not all deceptive falls, okay? Every time a player fell to the ground, it was coded, okay? We've got 4 categories. We've got high deception, low deception, no deception, okay? Done by multiple individuals, 90% repeatability on different coders, okay? We coded what the referee's response was, the league, the location on the field, the score at the time in the game, and whether they were playing home and away, okay? What we were really interested in was the high deception falls. Okay, there's a lot of ambiguity about these low deception. What we're interested in is the high deception falls, and that is when an individual has clearly not been touched but decides to throw themselves down to the ground anyway. Okay, now we've got multiple cameras on this. They're all professional games. We can get multiple cameras to review what went on. Okay. So what are the predictions? When do we expect individuals to dive? Okay, so we coded it in terms of different parts of the game, from the defensive to the attacking. What we'd expect is the most amount of dives per fall to occur in this area here. If a free kick is given to the diver here, there is an 80% chance of scoring a direct goal from that because it's a penalty. Okay, and it falls down quickly to about a 10% to less than 2%, and then so on and so forth. Okay, huge incentive for diving here, and then it goes back. Okay, what about the time in the game, or not necessarily the time in the game, the score in the game? Okay, you would expect that when it's all tight, that the frequency of diving to go up. Okay, so when there's a draw at the time and one goal can make a huge difference to a game, then that to affect it. And how does the response, the frequency of diving here, relate to a referee's response, their ability to pick up the diving? And we can compare the different leagues in that. So first of all, deception or high deception occurs at very low frequency, okay? Low enough frequency. Here's high deception. There's about 160 something high deception dives out of 2,800 falls, okay? 160, that's, 3 a game about. I suppose it's pretty high for high deception, Okay. Dive in the location. So the frequency of diving is highly affected by the location on the field. So again, this is the area where you would expect the highest diving because there's an 80% chance of scoring a goal here. Okay, and that's what we find. This is the dives per falls, okay, and we find that it decreases quite nicely across where the pitch zones are. Okay. So they're responding clearly, the players are responding clearly to the incentive or the potential reward for getting a free kick. Okay, they're just like crayfish so far. Okay. What about when the payoff is greatest? Well, we get the most dives when a game is tied at the time. Again, they're responding to the importance of that extra goal. Okay. Now, what about the referee's responses? Okay. These represent the different leagues. Okay. The 6 different leagues. These are the numbers of dives that occur per match in those leagues. Here are the rewards per dive. What that means is the probability that a dive is going to get rewarded with a free kick, as in the probability that the referee is going to get fooled. Okay? In those leagues where a referee is most likely to get fooled, a 70% chance of getting fooled, there is the highest amount of diving in that league. One where there's only a 20% chance, there's the lowest chance. So there's a close tracking between the receiver's ability to detect and what the players are doing. Now this is a correlation. We don't know what the causation here is. So obviously it could be the opposite, which is the players in this league are just damn good at fooling the referee. Okay? And these referees are no better or worse than these ones. We don't know. But we know is there is a close relationship between those. It's been driven by the referees or the talents of the players fooling. What's really curious is when we looked at the costs of diving. That is, how often was a player punished for throwing themselves into the air and rolling around on the ground unnecessarily? There was 2 cases across those across the 2,800 falls. There was 2 cases when an individual was punished, and in both cases they were not high deception falls. In both cases they were legitimate falls that the referee has got wrong and misinterpreted. So there is absolutely no cost associated from the referee's perspective pushing back against this behaviour. Okay. This was published in 2011. Of interest here is the fact that there's 2 leagues in the world that have really stamped out diving in the last 5 years. And it's the Australian League and it's the American League. And that is because they have started punishing players post-game. Referee can't detect it, but with a television camera you can go back and punish a player. And it's essentially been removed from those 2 leagues. And I don't think it's a surprise that those 2 leagues are up against other more popular codes of football, which are a little bit more physical, and the tolerance for rolling around on the ground when you haven't been hit is probably a lot lower in America and Australia. But it's curious that there's no punishment going on still in Europe. They tried to do it a couple of years ago. That player I mentioned, Didier Drogba, they tried to punish him. There was a big up in arms about it and they withdrew the punishment. It's very, very amusing. They know what the incentive is. So anyway, I hope that you've got something out of seeing the different forms of deception that are naturally employed by these different types of organisms. One where they hide their strength behind their claws, and one where it's a great bit of acting that occurs when the stakes are definitely enormous. So I'd like to thank my sponsors, and also the people involved with this research. Thank you for listening, guys. Yeah.
So I have two remarks related to two topics. One, perhaps this was just a figure of speech and you didn't intend it, but if I understood you correctly, in the last part of the crayfish discussion when you were talking about the population influence, you suggested that there's a facultative adaptation, that is, that the animals can detect the average size in the population, the density of the population, and they adjust their level of deception as a function of that. So that's a pretty complicated adaptation, right? If the population characteristics are stable, moderately stable across generational time, then a simpler explanation is that there's just selection. That there's no facultative adaptation, there's just selection for deception, as it were. That is, for lower muscle mass per size of claw, right?
Yeah, so...
And that's fluctuating over time as population dynamics change over time.
Yeah, so what I didn't add there is that entire population of, in southeast Queensland for these guys, of the two-tone fiddler crab, is representative of really just one population. They've got a larval stage where the larvae go out and then they sweep back in a highly randomised way.
I don't know where they're going to end up.
They have no idea where they're going to end up. And yeah, I agree. It's quite sophisticated that they can respond. I've done some work on larval amphibians, and what we found in these larval amphibians is that because the nature of small ponds can vary from place to place, is that they have a highly sophisticated way of responding to the predators in their actual environment. So if you grow up some tadpoles in environments with fish, they develop a certain shape, okay? Their tail becomes quite narrow, which allows them to get a really high sprint speed away from these fish that are basically, they suck the tadpoles in. If you grow them in an environment with larval beetles, or aquatic beetles, these beetles stab their prey. And so what you get is these tadpoles that grow their head here, and they grow these big fins like that. And what happens is if they get stabbed there, the tail just tears away, and they're really slow. So yeah, I think it is sophisticated, but I think that's based on other taxa, not surprising that they've got this sort of facultative response.
Okay, but it makes me think of a question about tadpoles, but I'll save it. I have a question about football, which is, so you described the costs, the benefits, and the very low costs. It seems to me that a prediction that, at least to the extent that, given that referees in the major leagues don't actually call fouls, or the fake fouls very often, they don't call diving, right? A prediction for what might happen if they start to is that, and of course it's contingent on the quality of the recording technology, but the ability to detect dives is in part contingent on the base rate of fouls. So if there are a lot of real fouls, then it's easier to mask a dive because there are many things going on in the field at any one time.
Yep.
Right? So if no one ever falls down in an entire game and I dive, I stand out.
Yep.
Right? Presumably, you can, since you already have the data, and because you've already recorded when there are what types of falls, you've already coded it all, you
Yep.
can look at base rate differences, and you can predict that dives will persist even as costs rise as a function of base rate, because detection will be more difficult. So if punishments are instituted, you'll see the players respond by reducing dives in low-frequency foul games, but maintaining dives in high-frequency foul.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, we've not thought about that. Yeah, well, think about that a bit more. A side note is that in the World Cup, when the World Cup comes around every 4 years, I mean, FIFA's not very good at like encouraging people to think well of them, but they care about what the game looks like sometimes, once every 4 years, and they don't like diving at all at that stage. And you've got referees that are punishing all over the place for that, and they get it wrong often. And players do not respond at all to that. Players are diving or they're throwing themselves down when it would obviously be beneficial, or there'll be no cost in a European league, but in a World Cup, it's just a dumb thing to do, and the players don't respond, and there's so many suspensions there. So it's really interesting that in a World Cup situation where you take the players out of their domestic leagues, is that there's a very different dynamic, and there's no time for players to adjust to that as well. Mm. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the role of learning with the crayfish and the fiddler crabs. Basically, I was wondering whether you could create a skeptical crayfish. Just thinking about the sort of, I think some of your work goes in that direction, right? Of having the variation in muscle density,
Yep.
To claw size, and I was just wondering, if you raised a crayfish in an environment where, for similarly sized claws, they always won because they were only paired with individuals that had low density muscles.
Yep.
Could you have crayfish that basically overestimated their ability or underestimated or were skeptical of the honesty of the signals?
Yes, I think you could definitely do those sorts of experiments, and that goes back to the winner effect that is very common in, I suppose in humans, but also non-human contests, where an individual, if it wins a fight, it's more likely to escalate another fight, and if it wins that fight, it's more likely to escalate again. And it's driven not necessarily by the strength of the animal, but by their perceptions of themselves. And the way I think about it is they're calibrating themselves to their environment. So if I go through this environment, first time I walk in this room, someone challenges me, they back down, someone challenges me again and back down, I get an inflated view of myself. And you can get that in lots of different organisms. There's some cool experiments on crickets where they do that. And I think you could do the same with weak crayfish or crayfish with, average claw strength. So you can get them an inflated view of their own self and see how that affects their behaviour. I think that's a wonderful experiment to do.
I'm wondering how sort of flexible the window of, how manipulable at detection of the sort of honesty of the signal would be.
Yeah, I don't know, but it would be cool experiments to do there, yeah. Well, we've done some experiments where we've, we might actually get back to some of the question you had earlier on, which was we've manipulated the size of the signal and the strength of the signal as well. So one easy way to manipulate the strength of the signal is you put a dab of super glue in there, and then they've got their claw, okay, and they can display their claw, but they can't inflict any costs on opponents. You can easily get rid of the super glue, by the way, as well. But anyway, they've got zero strength, and they fight at first as if they are just as strong as they used to be. And you can almost see it on their little crayfish face going, what's going on here? Why won't this individual back down? Okay, but you can do an opposite thing, which is you can take, they molt their claws on occasion, and you can take a malted claw and fit it over the top of the claw of a crayfish, so it looks like it's got a hell of a lot larger claw. And what happens then is that you'll get individuals backing down then, because they'll see a large clawed opponent, they'll back down, okay? But often you'll get that crayfish unaware of its large weapon that it's showing now, okay, and backing down when the other individual is prepared to back down. So what we've done is we've manipulated the size and strength of the claw to see that that's what they're looking at. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do the female crayfish always escalate to the fights? Why don't they deceive each other? Is there a story there?
Look, I'm not entirely sure. My guesstimate is that there's not a huge cost for getting it wrong. because the females are a lot weaker. And so if you mess up and you escalate against a female that's a hell of a lot stronger than you, she's not going to be to a strength that is going to be able to crush your head off. That's my interpretation, but I'm not sure. With a male, you get it wrong, massive claws, then yeah, they can inflict messy wounds on their opponents. It's actual fact. You can keep these individuals in jars, and you get to know when you're doing these experiments which one's the weak one, which one's the strong ones, and you fear the ones that you're picking up, the stronger ones, and the ones that like have got no muscle in there. You're so relaxed around them, they squash in your hand, no problems at all. Yeah.
With the soccer players, so another cost of diving is then you lose the opportunity to legitimately score a goal or pass it to a teammate who can score a goal.
Yeah.
But I'm having trouble thinking of any way to measure that, because even if you could look at each of your instances of diving and quantify how well in control of the ball was the player, what prospect the player had, it would be difficult to know what to just compare that to. The sort of universe of incidences in which they didn't dive. So I'm having trouble with a method, but it seems like this is, theoretically, this would be an influence on whether you dive or not.
Totally agree with that. Now, I'm going back to my own deceptive behaviours in soccer, but if I'm heading towards a goal, okay, and some leg goes across, I'm more likely to ride that, okay, and try to stay on my feet because there's a goal in front of me. But if I'm pointing away from the goal, okay, and this is what I think you could be doing, is like direction of travel, okay, towards the centre of the goal maybe. If I'm pointing away from the goal, okay, even if I ride that tackle and stay on my feet, it's a very, very difficult shot. But if I go down, there's an 80% chance I get a goal. I get the shot from there. So I think, direction of travel towards the goal will be a huge influence. Yeah.
All right, I don't know much about soccer. I enjoy it. There's no cost to, what do you call it, faking?
Yeah, diving, yeah.
And there is a marginal benefit. Why isn't it extremely common? I don't get it.
Very good point. And I think, so I tried to be careful in saying that there's no cost driven by the referee. When in actual fact, I think there's a reputational cost.
All right, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And people get reputations for being divers, and fans from opposite teams call them out. And no, in the end, no one wants to really get called a cheat all the time. But of course, your teammates, if you cheat once in a while in a very important situation, what does your teammates care? So yeah, I think there's a strong reputational cost for doing it all the time. And it's not always beneficial to do it because, sometimes it's better just to take the shot. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sorry.
Is football a data-driven game like baseball? I don't know, but are the teams collecting a lot of data and using those metrics to inform how they play and how they recruit players?
It is beginning to be a data-driven game, and really it's a huge industry now which is looking at network analyses of play. But to be honest, what I've seen is that there's a real disconnect between the data being provided and what the coaching staff take from those. I think what the coaching staff generally take is how often did Freddie touch the ball, how often did Freddie lose the ball, and how much did Freddie run during the game, how much did he sprint. I think they're just taking that. Right. And because there's just a plethora of data and no one really knows how to interpret that, because it's an extremely complex game and there's very different and subtle ways that the tactics that coaches can use. And I don't think necessarily that the network analyses have really caught up with the way that the coaches think about them. I think intuition from the coaches is still a lot better than a lot of those.
So they're not looking at, but the teams aren't looking at, the quality of the refs or the quality of their players to deceive. When I mean they're not aware of the kind of the nice relationship you found between diving and
No, I doubt it.
frequency.
I doubt it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a huge soccer fan as well, so this is just completely pleasing me. But I'm curious as to know whether or not the reputation of individual referees for their potential to dole out red cards as opposed to...
It's similar to what you've just said there, yeah.
Back off. Whether that is taken into consideration before the game even starts as part of strategy, as they say, okay, well, we have, say, Baldomero Toledo, who is notorious for dealing out yellows all the time. Will a person be more hesitant to attempt something that he might attempt versus another ref who might be a little bit more lenient, or let's go with FIFA, might be on the take?
Yeah. I'm not sure, but I'm sure the individual players are aware of their relationships with the referees. Yeah, I think the individual players know what they can and can't get away with individual referees, and they're known by name. So, but I don't think the clubs would do this sort of analysis on the referees. The coach will probably whinge about specific referees, but that's about it. Yeah.
The claw regeneration phenomenon is pretty cool. It seems like it has potential for getting at the facultative calibration thing. Presumably, they can facultatively calibrate the muscle investment more than the hard shell investment, except when there's an incident where they lose the shell, and then they can grow exactly the claw they want given the environment they're in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They don't though, which is weird.
So you should.
Well, to be honest, we were only looking at original claws in that analysis. We didn't do the same analysis with regenerated and see if we got the same pattern with those. So I'm not sure. Yes, you would expect there to be something similar along those lines. But what we do find when they do regenerated a claw, it seems to be always the same length, and never a replication of the original, never. Across all the different fiddler crab species as well.
It's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Could they, in that situation, could they take advantage of their reputation? They know how tough they're thought to be up to that point, and they're like, aha, now I can get away with a same size, weaker thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, crayfish are quite sophisticated in a way, is that they will watch two individuals fight, and that will affect the way that they'll respond to each of those individuals. So if they watch two same size individuals fight, they'll be more likely to escalate against the loser than the winner. Yeah. So my gut feeling is some of the experiments I'd like to do is to manipulate the social environment where the crayfish get to know the individuals around them, and that if there's deceptive individuals, weak individuals in the population, then they gain a reputation, and the individuals are no longer afraid of those and they're prepared to escalate against those. And that may be a real disincentive towards a dishonest signal. If you're in a social environment where they learn, rather than just the frequency of being getting called on your bluff, those individuals know who you are. Yeah.
I was wondering if you've looked at diving in women's leagues.
No, I haven't. No.
Do women dive
Yeah, they do. It's certainly not as common.
Okay, I was just thinking about just because of the sex differences in the crabs. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't know anything about fiddler crabs, but so how long does it take to regenerate a claw? Because I'm wondering if there's basically sort of a trade-off between having a more fine-tuned or bigger claw. Like I'm wondering if some of those notches, and I forget what you were calling them, those little notches and stuff, if that takes time if like developing a plan for that kind of claw, it takes more time or something, and you're sort of trading off the amount of time that you want to go.
Yeah, I bet it does. I bet it takes a lot more time and a lot more energy to do those sorts of things. I mean, that's what creates the claw as a weapon. That's what they can get in there and crush an opponent. But interestingly, okay, the claws of fiddler crabs are used as signals to opponents, but also to females. Now, females don't care at all. They don't seem to care about whether it's an original or a regenerated claw. And whereas males may like see the size of the claw and back down if it's much larger, you know, if they're similar sized claws, they'll escalate and the regenerated one will lose, okay? But in the female case, they don't care. And I think that makes sense because what they're essentially looking at is all of their little babies are not going to have regenerated claws. It's the genes for the original claw that obviously get expressed. And also, if you're a male that's just had its arm ripped off and you've grown a new claw, you've gone through a very traumatic experience and got through it okay. You know, that may be a very good indicator of the quality of that individual. It's like if Muhammad Ali got his arm ripped off and you bred with Muhammad Ali, you're still going to get Muhammad Ali's offspring, not the armless variety. Yeah.
So are the crayfish you use, are they lab bred?
No, they're all captured from the wild.
So they had some sort of social distribution.
Yep. Yeah.
So that is actually a perfect setup for the question that I want to ask, which is, so Erica was talking about skepticism, right? And it seems to me, and maybe you have to model this to know for sure, but it seems to me that the animals from the deceptive populations, that is the lower density, smaller animals that have a poorer correlation between claw size and strength, should be more skeptical because deception is more common in their group than those from the other population, to the extent that they're bimodally distributed, right? And you might say, well, if skepticism is rampant, then there's no benefit to deception, but there is if the expected value is a function of the probability of detection, and the probability of detection is a function of the combination, the product of skepticism and frequency of opportunity for detection. So if I'm in a low density population, even if most of my audience are skeptics, if I don't encounter them very often, then it's still worth being deceptive.
Yeah.
So if you know the groups of origin of the animals, you know whether they come from a group that has high deception frequency or low deception frequency, then experimentally you can test their level of skepticism by seeing the extent to which their response is shaped by claw size versus strength versus actual test, right, where they grapple to start to inflict.
So are you predicting there that you would see a coevolution of maybe for a population high frequency of deception and high skepticism as well?
Yeah, so if you have facultative deployment of it, then there should be, I mean, we're calling it skepticism. There doesn't have to be a representation of deception in the animal's mind. All that has to happen is that it attends less directly to claw size and tests through grappling more readily, right? And that's the behavioral manifestation that we can call skepticism, right? That is, they're less easily persuaded by the overt signal. And those could be linked, and it could still be evolutionarily stable if it seems to me, like maybe you have to model it to be certain, but if the frequency of interaction is low, right? I don't have to, if I get away with it even a small percentage of the time, but I don't actually get tested very often, then it's still worth the huge savings of not putting muscle.
Yeah, no, I totally buy that. Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.